Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our conversation on smart buildings and bustling streets, a new perspective on work, live, and play. I think we've all seen so many changes that have happened in our cities across the globe during the pandemic and now afterwards. More people working from home, commercial office usage is declining, street closures and more space in cities devoted to people, and the rise of 15-minute cities. Through all of this, there's a need to design and construct intelligent places and digitally augmented offices, as well as reimagining public space that are responsive to these changes. It's incumbent on all of us who want to see great cities think about how we reframe the expectations of the new urban world for people and place. And to that point, let's get into it. Bill, the first question is to you. Everyone's heard about autonomous cars, but your company focuses on autonomous buildings as well. What is that? And how do those buildings work to operate for the end user and better serve cities?
Yeah, I think, for the past 20 years, every industry's been, let's say, disrupted to some degree by digitization. And I think it's sort of like a series of dominoes. If you're farther back in it, sometimes you think you're not going to get disrupted by digital. And I think our industry has been, safe from some of that. But what I think we are seeing now is that our customers, whether they're consumers in retail or businesses in commercial space, and the people who work in them, they're starting to make other decisions that are only possible through digital. So there's a disruption going on right now, whether we want to say it is or isn't, and it is, what is your residence and does it become your place of work? Do you want to go back to work? Do you want to, go to physical retail? Or is all that going to get disrupted by digital technology? And I think for us, as a property investor, property developer, we would say that if you fight it and you say you don't want to do it, you could end up being fully disruptive through this process. But what do people want, whether it's any of those locations, is they want better experiences. And that means embracing digitization into what you're doing. And I think we've struggled with that because the technology that we have isn't leading to the outcomes. So I think to us, this idea of autonomous buildings is this idea, what do you bring in to digitize this environment to deal with an experience so people want to go back to work and want to combine back to work with work from home? How do you create retail settings that align with digital retail and physical retail? And I think we're really experimenting with a lot of these things in a lot of different places. And I'd say the end result of this is just like transportation is getting digitized. We're going to see digitization in ours. And I think that fundamentally is what we're thinking about when we think about what does an autonomous building have to be.
So it won't be just autonomous buildings floating around by themselves.
They don't move, let me say that.
Right.
But transportation will come to it, and that will impact it.
Great. And Bettina, technology allows us to design and construct much more responsive buildings that respond to stimuli and generate massive amounts of data. How does this impact building design and urban planning, and what do you expect the impact on cities to ultimately be?
The technology today, as Bill just mentioned, allows us to collect the data, harvest it, process it, and then us as architects and urban planners, we have the opportunity to analyze it, to work with that data. And I would start with buildings where today we can integrate sensors, we have smart lighting, all kinds of controls for air conditioning, heating, cooling. When we speak about autonomous buildings, I would say, let's look at the automotive industry. Those technologies have been around for a long time. Construction is much more complicated. We don't have prototypes. But I think with today's technology, we can make buildings much more intelligent. That means on the one hand side, we have sensors that look towards the infrastructure of a building that will help us to decarbonize buildings. Like, why do we need to heat and cool buildings 24 hours if no one is in the office? On the other hand, we have also data that we can collect from the users of a building. That can happen through handheld devices or also through sensors. And all this together can make buildings much better, much more sustainable, much more user-friendly, and I would say the outcome at the end of the day should be for the human being. And often that's overlooked when we speak about technology. We're all excited about the technology. It's like a fourth industrial revolution that we're going through. For us as architects, I think it's very, very important to really put the human at the center point, like questions, why are we doing that? What can be the best outcome, also in regards to health, economy, all questions that are out there.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I think we see a lot of these innovations happening in the private sector, but I've worked in the public sector throughout my career, focused on cities and now urban libraries. And I think oftentimes we've seen public sector initiatives that have really pushed on green buildings and health and sensor technology. And so I really think that kind of connecting people to place, both in the private sector as well as the public sector, can make such an incredible difference. Bill, maybe talk to us about the data you've analyzed that delves into the different typologies of those people returning to work and what you're seeing. What are some of those big trends that are happening right now?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is figure out how to use the data created by buildings. I worked with Cisco 15 years ago. We wrote this paper on intelligent buildings, and we're pushing it. And so a lot of that infrastructure went in, and today our buildings generate tremendous amount of data. I think you probably see this as well. What we never really did was try to figure out the outcome. And I think, so we've got all this data, and you know, I once heard someone say, data's like milk. You can collect as much as you want, but eventually if you don't drink it, it's going to waste. So it's not about the collection side of it, it's trying to figure out what are the right outcomes you're trying to get to. And I think this is very, very tricky, but I'll talk about some of the things we're seeing. We're really trying to explore either the workplace or the retail and see what are the behaviors that people have, not looking at individuals. So we don't want to know what John did. What we want to know is what are the kinds of personas that we have for people using space. And what we're seeing is a foundational change in the space that's going on. So a good example is the personas of, we're finding that there are different kinds of people in the workforce. And even if you say everybody must return to work, there's a group of people we know that's about 20%, it's about 18% we've seen, that just say, okay, as long as everybody else returns to work, they won't notice I'm not here. And I think we see some of that. But we also see people we would call event attenders. They come every week. They come 3 days a week. But if you tie their Outlook data, what you would see is they come for usually 2 or 3 hour blocks, usually driven by some event that's going on. So we call those the event attenders. Turns out that's about 25% of the people have become event attenders. So is that return to work or is that not return to work? Is that, if you mandated 3 days a week and they're there 3 days a week, but they only happen to come for 3.5 hours, does that count? So we have some foundational things going on in commercial space. Now, we've really found about 5 or 6 personas like this. I think you'll see the same thing in retail. The kind of behaviors people have is changing. The second thing we're doing is starting to look at the data from a sustainability. And you know, we haven't bent the curve on sustainability despite building sustainable buildings. There's still more unsustainable things that go on. If you just look at the amount of food and waste in food that goes in. Now, a lot of people return to work. It turns out one thing we know, if you give more food, people return to work. Or a group of people return to work, the hungry. You know, it's about 50% of your population is hungry. They come back to work because you give them free food. But how do you know how much food to get? Because if you're really going to count sustainability, you got to look at the cost of everything from getting the food, transporting the food, what does it cost, the waste, and so on, and that never is calculated. So we're starting to calculate against not the building, but the behaviors of people within the building, and if you're going to be really sustainable, you got to look at behaviors. So I think what we're finding, and Bettina said it, it's about the people. So what we're trying to look at is not what does John or Nancy do, but but what is the personas? How do people behave? And can you start to create better experiences and make it work with the digital environment? And I think that's the kind of thing we're looking at with the data, is those would be some examples.
So I'm curious, a follow-up, with everything in the building industry being based on such long-term investments, how do you think that might change some of that data if we have a recession, or if, overall structures start to shift a little bit with returning to work versus continuing to work remotely?
Yeah, so, being in the digital world, not in the property world most of my life, I'd say most of the best technology advances have occurred in a downturn economy. So if you look at the first internet meltdown, the winners came out of that. Even a lot of people thought Amazon wouldn't win. There was an article that said, they've gone out of business on one of the business magazines. That didn't turn out like they thought. But a lot of the winners came out, and a lot of people lost. And we saw that in the 2008. We saw a whole new set of digital companies. So I think that when I look at where we are now, this is the opportunity. There's been enough prop tech investment. There's been enough infrastructure put in the last 15 years that people have to get really, really crafty. Because if you don't, they're not coming back to work, and are you going to have too much commercial space? We already have that dialogue. They're not coming back to the retail. What are you going to do? Have half the space empty? So I actually believe that those winners are going to be people who get really, really crafty about what to do to create the experiences to drive people there. And if you don't deliver better outcomes, well, you're going to be just like, Blockbuster. You're not going to make it. But if you're like Netflix and you figure out how to make that shift, you're going to win. And I think that's what's going to happen in the next 5 years.
I think on that point, Bettina, the design of spaces is going to matter tremendously. How do you design spaces to bring people back in and be responsive to these changes we're seeing?
I think one important thing we have to look at is really artificial intelligence. If we speak about data and think that further, I would almost look at artificial intelligence as a future space. The question is, where does the urban environment and the digital world merge, and what is it? So I think also important is really, as Bill mentioned, experiences. What do you create? Also, I think we want to create healthier environments in regards to air quality, in regards to really what is someone doing? Is the office as we know it today, that has been around for 50, 60 years, is that still the same design that we really need? Perhaps there is more exchange happening at an event. Perhaps our experiences change. When we think about just like 30 years back, there was no internet. Our offices looked almost the same. So as architects and designers, we were really asking the question, what is this kind of virtual world? How can we overlap it with the physical world? And what's the outcome? So I would say certain functions are still the same. People will meet in person. It will be a very different conversation than online. But like, how do all these virtual tools actually overlap with the physical? How can they enhance our life and also our work life? And I think we as architects and designers have a great future in front of us because there are so many more tools. Just as for an office space, I think app, sensor technology, really useful tools, and not just for the interaction for people, but also for the building as infrastructures itself. And if we extend that to cities, urban places, we're looking at urban intelligence. So the same as we can use sensors in a building, cities have the possibility to use sensors for air quality, for crime. That data can also be harvested through mobile devices. Any one of us has a smartphone. So I think there is a lot of opportunity out there, and it's all about how can we aggregate data and how can we analyze it. And I think very important will be what we do with this data and what will actually be frameworks around it, that it's used for the common good.
So sticking with this topic, Bettina, on the idea of kind of merging the physical and virtual worlds, there's been a lot of talk about Web3 and the metaverse. I actually did some research about a year ago looking at cities in the metaverse and how they were starting to think about these shifts and how you might be able to offer service delivery from a municipal standpoint. Obviously, Facebook turning into Meta, all of these conversations have happened, but there hasn't really been kind of a crystallization of what the metaverse truly is. How do you see it within kind of the building and design sector? What could Web3 really mean as these transitions are happening?
Yeah. We have done a collaboration with Leica Geosystems, where actually the, so to speak, metaverse is our real world. That means think of a map. That map is actually a 3D map. It gets visualized through AI, and at the end, it looks like a video. So we inserted actually one of our designs into that world. So I would say perhaps the start is, what is the metaverse? It's a very trendy word right now. It's everyone speaking about it. Apple just said the other day there will be another metaverse. It's something else coming up. I would say let's look at technology. We are advancing in enormous speed. The metaverse that we see right now often is like a replica, almost like a movie world. Mm-hmm. I think for us architects and urban planners, it will be interesting if that digital twin is actually the real world. So we have the tools. A lot of cities are actually mapped, or areas getting mapped. If we can use those digital twins, analyze the data we receive from sensors, and then think that even further, if we could send our avatars into that world and understand how they feel, then we could test our urban environments before we build them.
That's great. And Bill, how much are you all thinking at Lend-Lease Digital about Web3 and the metaverse?
Yeah, I think that, so my personal take is 10 years out for the way people have talked about it. Mm-hmm. I think we don't actually have good use cases except for gaming. Mm-hmm. And if you look at gaming, and I think I recently heard a talk that basically gaming and crypto are kind of coming together, where the people get in gaming and it is unbelievable what they spend to get a sword of a certain kind that has a name, like Dark Lord or something like this, and everybody's got to buy one, and a kid who's 12 years old can open up a crypto account online pretty easily to get the tokens he needs, but he can't go to the Wells Fargo and get a bank account. So we see that online, a next generation is going to come out. And I think some people say, oh, that's not going to happen. But if you go back 25 years and think about cell phones, I remember 25 years ago going to work and people were saying, I'm never going to carry a cell phone. You don't really need it. I pick up the phone on my desk. Well, of course, we don't go to the office anymore, so that doesn't work for you. So I think that the fact is it's a next generation thing. However, there is technology now that can change the game. So if you look at the metaverse, a lot of that that technology will be based on something called digital twins. And now this is the most immediate need of it. And if you look at a digital twin, in our universe, a digital twin would be an exact replica of anything. And if you look at the automotive space and you look at autonomous driving, the reason autonomous driving works is they create a digital twin of the real world that you're riding on, and they use that to make decisions for the vehicle. And we've seen this in the aviation world today. Almost everything on a plane has a digital twin, and they use this to predict for maintenance failures. And it's much more accurate than it was before. So I think what we're pushing is this idea, can we use digital twins in the building? And we want to really predict behavior. I think everybody wants to come and say, well, control your HVAC and somehow more sustainable and we could do that. Those are small digital twins. But what we want to do is begin to build a digital twin of the building and build it before you build it with pure physics. So for example, while we'll do wind studies, the fact is without a digital twin, you really don't understand the atmospherics of wind moving through any major space you're building. The modeling of it hasn't been done as well as it could. And I think this is true of that. Fire egress, looking at behaviors of people leaving in case of emergencies. Our ability to build it before we build it is here today. To me, that is the metaverse. We have the ability today to build digital twins of something down to a fidelity of an individual component like a nut or a bolt or anything you're talking about. Once you do that, then you can run physics against it. You can really understand, can you build that? How do you build it? What's the order? What's the supply chain? And I think we're just one step away. And by the way, the aviation world did this a decade ago, and they build much as complicated as we do. But I think if we can harness that technology the right way, our industry can be foundationally changed in the next decade. So the metaverse, as Meta talks about it with AR, VR, et cetera, that will play into this in 10 years, and everybody will have to do something with it. Nobody knows exactly what. But the digital twin stuff, you're going to see that over the next 5 years become more and more a part of the way we do things in design.
That's great. So we have time for one last question. And I think really what I'd like to dig into is we talked a lot about data collection. But what that also kind of brings up are privacy concerns. How do we approach all of this technology work and think about privacy while at the same time innovating? And maybe Bettina, we can start with you.
I definitely think that it's very important that we will have global frameworks, how we will use artificial intelligence in particular. When we speak about Web3, one of the main points is also that everyone owns their own data. And I think if we think of cryptons, maybe also in the real estate industry, maybe there is a new way of trading that is in front of us. Maybe the value of those buildings will be in the digital twin that have all the data. And maybe we go away from what we see right now. Half Midtown is empty. Office buildings are empty. Their value was always like location, location, location. Mm-hmm. And maybe there will be a shift pretty soon. Yeah. And I think that is interesting. And in general, so I think it's a question for the public-private environment and also seen globally that we establish frameworks for the good, for this technology that's in front of us.
Yeah, definitely. Bill, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say three things. One is, for some reason, digitally, we're willing to lay it all out there. I mean, everything. I mean, there's the privacy digitally isn't there at all, and it's worse probably than I think many of us realize. Yet physically, we get all worried about privacy. So I'd say I think that the digital world has, we're going to have to set regulations in the digital world, and whatever happens there is going to flow down. And you can already see the European Union trying to figure this out. But I think there's going to be a lot of regulation. So number one is expect the government to come in and tell you what you got to do. I think they're here to help. But I think you're going to see that over the next decade, more regulation. So you just follow the regulation. I think the second thing is, though, that we're going to see where, again, the more data is collected than ever before. So the building won't complain if you collect data on the building, right? And if it does complain, you don't care. But if you collect data on a person, now that's what you really, I think that's when we talk about privacy. Now the question is, where do you draw the line? For us, I have to say, we don't want to know what John does. What we want to know is how the behaviors of populations are. Once you look at a population, it's very different. And so I think that's where we think drawing the line will start, because you gotta be careful. Although when you're on Amazon, they don't draw it on populations, right? They draw it on, okay, that person shopped, there's John, there's Nancy, here's who they are, here's how they do it. And by the way, even when they're not online, I'm gonna send them stuff and tell them they should get back online. I think, though, you're gonna start to see some of that more physically, but in the physical world. And by the way, our kids are probably more used to it. So I think it's gonna continue to open up a little more. The last thing I would say here, though, is that it really comes down to an organization to have a clear policy. And that will separate companies out. The problem is, I think most companies don't even think about their policies, and so unfortunately, they may have one group inside the organization collecting data, and nobody knows about it, and then one day, they get in trouble for it. And I think within organizations like cybersecurity, at some point, they're going to have to ask the question, is everybody doing the right thing? So what's the policy? So look for regulation. I think there'll be, as part of ESG, a push towards more and more policy. And the last thing is, privacy is a bit of a mirage. No matter what we want and think, the fact is our data is out there in such a way, physically and digitally, I don't think there's putting the toothpaste back in that tube.
And there's some truth to that. Well, thank you for a fascinating conversation this afternoon as we navigate the ever-changing world ahead of us.
Thank you.